Ivan Pavlenko, From Family to Family. Chapter 1, Part 2.4, Our Family Tree, read by Natalia Buzova. My father, Ivan Grigorovich Pavlenko, was born according to the old style on December the 7th, 1895. I know little about his childhood and youth, and he himself did not like to talk about himself. They named him Ivan in honor of his grandfather Ivan. In our family, it was already said that the names of Grigory and Ivan alternated and were passed down from one generation to another. That's why I named my first son Grigory. My sister Oля has a document about our father's education. Certificate. The Lokhvitsa District Teachers' Council hereby certifies that the son of the Cossack Pavlenko Ivan Grigorovich, village Yachniki, Lukavolis, Lokhvitsa district, born on December the 7th, 1895, successfully completed a course of study at the Yachniki Primary Public School. School Council President, Inspector of Public Schools, Council members. In the midst of World War I, my father was drafted into the army. He served in the cavalry and lancers. In 1919, my father married my mother, and from that time we were more often called the Krasovskis than the Sheshenkos. Here is the photo of Ivan Grigorovich and his wife Nastya Mikhailivna. As long as we had our own land, my father worked in the field from morning to evening, and in winter he threshed sheaves in the cornfield with a flail. In the evenings he sat down to sew and repair the villagers' shoes. But in the 1930s he abandoned his shoemaker's craft because he was threatened with heavy taxation by the state. In the collective farm he was a private foreman and head of the audit commission. For 2 years, he was a seller in a village store. In 1941, my father fell from a tall apple tree and broke his collarbone. Probably that is why he was not drafted into the army from the first days of the war. When the village was liberated from the Germans, the 48-year-old father was taken into the active army and without any preparation was thrown into the fording of the Dnieper. Father crossed the river and was attacked in Zhytomyr. There, according to my research, the military unit was cut off by General Huber's tank group, and the father either died in the battle or was captured and did not survive there. The mother received a message that he went missing on the Zhytomyr direction. In his last letter to my mother, my father wrote, "We are advancing on Zhytomyr. Vasily Yevtushenko was seriously wounded in the battle, and I carried him to the medbed, but he died from severe wounds. I'm going west to free Maria and Vasil from captivity." My father died in December 1943 when he was 48 years old. A detailed analysis of the data from the website of the OBD Memorial shows that Ivan Grigorovich Pavlenko fought in the 38th Army, 211th Rifle Division, 894th Rifle Regiment, first in Zhytomyr and from the end of December in the Kazathyn-Berdychev direction. And most likely he went missing, died in the period from January the 24th to the 28th, 1944. In the area of the villages of Zozivka, Shenderivka, Rotmistrovka of Linovetsky district and Ocheretna village of Pliskovetsky district of Vinnytsia region. Despite his age, the father somehow ended up in intelligence, together with his fellow villager Ivan Trofimovich Stetsenko, who returned from the war alive. This is how he told about one of the intelligence episodes. The company commander summoned your father and me and sent us to the village to find out if there were any Germans there. We left the forest and then we had to go through a field for 200 meters. Crouching down, we ran to the village, went around the outermost estate and just left the house, and there, right in front of us, half a dozen Germans were cleaning machine guns. I was just speechless. Shall we shoot or run away? And the father got down on one knee, and what a gunshot he fired. He shot everyone in a moment, and then when he ran away to the forest, being 8 years younger than him, I could not catch up. While rescuing us, our men opened fire from the forest, and we safely returned to the company. I will tell more than once about other pages of my father's life. Now, I will talk about my maternal lineage. My mother, Nastya Mikhailivna Krasovska, was born on April the 10th, the 24th, 1903. On her father's side, she came from the serfs of the Polish Lord Albukovsky. Before the revolution, his house stood near Yarky, where lilac bushes grew until recently. There, even now, you can dig a brick, a shard, or some economic object out of the ground. Mr. Albukovsky was obviously from that part of the Polish nobility that, starting from the 15th century, colonized Ukrainian lands. And his Krasovsky serfs were either imported from Poland or enslaved local peasants. It is unknown what rank and wealth Albukovsky was, but living on the Lochwitzer-Hlinsk road, he kept an inn and a tavern and also had his own land. My great-grandfather, Gerasim Konstantinovich Krasovsky, was first a coachman for Mr. Albukovsky, who liked him and sent to study at the Yakhmyky school for several years, after which he became the Lord's scribe and housekeeper. Obviously, a literate person from the serfs was needed in the household, so as not to hire from outside. When he got freedom in 1861, my great-grandfather had nothing else except for a little literacy. No land, no house. Literacy meant a lot then, and yet it was necessary to seek some kind of shelter. And the great-grandfather married Katerina Artemyevna Dyachenko. Once upon a time, the entire foothills from Zarazom to Melnik, with gardens and a small forest, belonged to the Dyachenkos, or the Nabywailos in street terms. They were, as I said before, impoverished nobles. One of them, Artemy Amos, studied and became a professor at Kiev University, which is also confirmed by the Ukrainian encyclopedia. Amos and his brother Mikita were the first professors of mathematics at Kiev universities. This is the photo of Mikita. But he became blind at an early age and died in 1852, leaving his son Mykola and daughter Katerina in Yashniki. Katerina was a minor and could no longer study, living with an adult brother who himself was not drawn to science, but was willing to live a dissolute life. He also gave less land to his sister, to whom their father had bequeathed 13 acres of land. After bribing the land surveyor, he cut several worse pieces for her, not even reaching 10 acres. After the division of the land, Katerina married my great-grandfather Gerasim Krasovsky. Together, they built a house and planted a garden. This is how the Krasovskys' nest was born. And Mykola had two sons, an older one, I don't remember his name, and a younger one, Vasil. The Dyachenkos, Alyoshenkos, Sashko and Ivan came from the eldest. They entered the collective farm during collectivization and did not fall under dispossession. And Vasil Vasilik stayed in the family yard and was considered a Mr. Lord. He had a large, though very old, iron-roofed house and a beautiful garden. There was probably up to 20 acres of land, too. He had a wife, Hima, from the rich, and two daughters, Natalka and Maria. They were already third cousins to my mother, and Aunt Natalka was my godmother. She married Savka Nuzhny from Haponivka. During collectivization, they were dispossessed and kicked out of the house. There was a collective farm, apiary, and a garden in their yard. Maria's husband died at the front, and she returned to the village, built a house in her parents' yard, and worked on a collective farm. Her husband's surname was Krotenko, and Savka Nuzhny, Natalka's husband, returned from the front without a leg, and he was also allowed to build a house in the old yard. Both of them are long gone. and their eldest son Grigory works as a road foreman at the Bilovody station. There, he with his wife, zoo technician, built a house. And the youngest son, Volodymyr, lived with his mother until the end, worked on a collective farm. Great-grandfather Gerasim and his wife Katerina had three daughters, Marusia, Sofia, and Odarka, as well as the son Mikhailo, my grandfather. The eldest daughter, Marusia, was married in Yuskivsky, and she and her husband left somewhere for better lands. The second daughter, Sofia, married Sakhno, who lived in the part of the village called Chuguyev in Yakhniki. Her only daughter, Orishka, married Andrei Shkuro from Dnipropetrovsk region in the famine year of 1921. They had one daughter, Zina. She graduated from medical school and worked as a nurse in Kirovograd region. The youngest daughter, Odarka, was married to Nazarenko in Zapadintsy. She had 5 sons and 4 daughters. First, I will tell you about the sons, who were my mother's cousins. All of them had something to do with the revolution. The elder Grigory was the head of the Komnizam and Revkom in his native village, and at Denikin time he hid in Yashniki at my grandmother's, and later became a kind of chief in Kharkiv. His brother Pavlo also found himself there, brother Ivan in Kiev, Semen in Mariupol. The fifth brother, Alexei, died in the battles against the Whites. I have never seen those great uncles, but I have heard stories that they became great people and were communists. Only all of them were repressed as enemies of the people in 1934-1939, and their fate is unknown to this day. Now, I will tell you about Odarka's daughters. The eldest was Nadezhda. She married in the village of Bessali. Then Hanna was married in Shmyli. Her son was a foreman in a collective farm for a long time. Paraska married Prokip Kryga in Kharkivsky. And the youngest, Marusia, stayed in Zapadintsy and married Tarapata. With the exception of Nadezhda, I had the opportunity to visit all those maternal sisters. A visit to Aunt Paraska's in Kharkivsky was especially memorable. I once came to Kharkivsky to hold a Komsomol meeting. At that time, I was the second secretary of the district committee of the Komsomol. After the meeting, already late in the evening, I went to her house. Her husband was happy to have a guest. Seeing me, he immediately announced, "Paraska, lay the table." After a few minutes, there was a sizzle in the kitchen, and soon a pan with lard and scrambled eggs appeared before us. "And take the vodka yourself from the cupboard," said the aunt to her husband, and went to the kitchen. The owner ceremoniously took out a bottle from the cupboard, deftly knocked off the cork, and poured vodka into glasses. "We clinked glasses," he mentioned for me to tip first. Well, so I agreed. I was drinking and felt something was wrong. My mouth did not burn. I drank it, and I could barely hide my smile because it was such a light vodka. "Well, cheers," said the owner, raised the glass to his lips and sipped, and then he stopped at half a glass, looked at the bottle in surprise, and shouted, "Paraska, but this is water." My aunt came running and clapped her hands. "Oh my God, but this is medicine." At those words, something bubbled in my stomach. The daughter also came into the room. She said it was diluted caffeine for a baby so that it wouldn't hurt. The only great-grandfather Gerasim and great-grandmother Katerina's son Mikhailo married a woman from Zapadintsy, also Katerina Tarapativna, my grandmother. He received only 3 acres of land from his parents, as it was actually his mother's, and she, remembering her dispute with her brother Mykola Dyachenko, had divided the land, giving 2 acres to her daughters and 3 acres to her son. His mother's relatives arranged for Mikhailo to study at the Yakhniki school, where he completed 4 grades. After the marriage, grandfather Mikhailo made business acquaintances with Lochvitsa Jews and opened a shop in his house and gave the land to tenants. His business was probably going well because in 1909 he built a nice house, covered with iron, on a platform with a beautiful porch, shutters, and moldings under the roof. There was a school in it before the revolution, and the grandfather lived in the old house with his wife and two daughters. My grandfather's health was failing. He suffered from asthma and shortness of breath. He died in 1913 at the age of 48. His wife lived with her two daughters, Nastya and Ulita, poorly, mainly due to the leased land and a new house for the school, where there was a classroom and an apartment for the teacher Maria Nikandrivna Prokhorova. In 1919, the eldest daughter Nastya, my mother, married my father. He was then 24 years old and my mother was 16 and 8 years younger than my father. She finished primary school where she excelled. She took books from the teacher who lived in their house and read them one by one. After finishing the fourth grade as the best student, she was recommended to continue her education at the Lochvitsa district school and stay at state expense. But the father died and the war began. Nothing worked with further training. Nevertheless, even with primary education, the mother was quite educated and well-read, wrote competently, and knew Russian classical literature well. In her youth, the mother was black-haired and beautiful, had a wonderful voice, and knew many folk songs. She also believed in God and sang in the church choir. Together with my father, my mother worked on the land, took everything that could be sold to Lochvitsa, to the bazaar. Fruits, eggs, butter, cheese, sour cream, chickens, everything was collected by the parents for the household. They dreamed of a couple of horses, a new house. My father had 4.5 acres of his land and an additional 1.5 from my mother. However, mother-in-law did not like my father. He was a good landlord, but independent and strict. He did not pay much attention to the whims of his mother-in-law, and she obviously wanted, as before, to be a full-fledged housewife in the house and also save something for her youngest daughter, who was about to marry soon. And that's how it started. Ivan Sergeyevich Solonucha, Ptichka, married the younger daughter. The entire household had to be divided in half. The house, the vegetable garden, the garden. After all, 1.5 acres of the grandmother's land remained for my mother, and 1.5 went to Ulita with her husband. A store was built in the former classroom, and our father and mother settled there, and in the two rooms where the teacher had lived, the grandmother with her daughter and son-in-law stayed. I've lived with the rich son-in-law. Now I will try to live with the poor one, said the grandmother. Now my father had 6 acres, 7 hectares and 200 meters of land, and Ptichka, together with grandmother's land, had something like 3 acres. In addition, my father had a little forest near Stepuki, up to half a hectare, and the same amount of hay in the meadow. After the partition, all the farm buildings, the barn, the hut, and the suit remained with the grandmother and the youngest son-in-law. But my father, with the help of his brothers, quickly made a fortune. Their horses were especially helpful in tilling the land. Father planted watermelons and melons. They grew well and were valued at the bazaar. In addition, my father worked as a landlord during the day and sewed people's boots at night, which also contributed to the family budget. Over the years of NEP, new buildings appeared in our half of the garden. A cast barn, a pantry under thin tiles, a cellar, and a well. We had our own sleigh, wagon, plow, scraper, 2 harrows, a fan, and my mother had a workbench, a sawn tool, a spinning wheel, and a mortar. They got a bull mare, a cow, sheep, pigs, and chickens. Father was going to build a new house to live completely separately, but collectivization came, followed by hunger, poverty, and lawlessness. Our family somehow endured all that. And Ivan Ptichka did not stick to mastery. He did not go to the collective farm, and the towing crooks raked out all the grain from their bins. Grandma Katerina died, followed by her son Grisha. The grandmother's son-in-law went to Russia for bread, taking with him some new clothes, and ended up in the town of Opochka, Pskov region. There he got a job as a postman and took his aunt Ulita with their two children, Mikhailo and Ivan. 2 years later, Ivan Solonucha became the head of the post office, and financial conditions improved. Daughter Halia was also born. The children went to school, but the war began. Aunt Ulita saw her husband off to the front and stayed with her 3 children. And when the husband returned from the war, they broke up. Ivan and Halia went to live with their father, and Mikhailo, born in 1930, stayed with his mother. In 1952, Mikhailo got married. He took his wife Nadia from Sviridivka. They got a 3-room apartment because the family grew by 2 children, daughter Katya and son Sergei. Katya started working in a bank and married an officer who was demobilized and started working as an engineer. They built a house in Lokhvitsa and lived separately from their parents. They have daughters Zhenya and Olenka. Aunt Ulita died at the age of 81, and Mikhailo Sergei graduated from the Polytechnic Institute. Mikhailo and Nadia stayed alone. They lived in Lokhvitsa on the 30th anniversary of October Street, LA. Aunt Ulita's younger son Ivan and daughter Halia live in Opochka, Pskov region, have their own families, and their father, Ivan Sergeyevich Solonucha, died in the late 60s. Something was wrong with the heart.